Welcome to Toddle's School Leaders Project. On today's episode, we welcome Hudson Harper from the downtown school. What I found really surprising about this conversation was the direction that it took. We began by just talking about data and data security, and I'm not gonna lie, I was a little bit intimidated just because it was a really tech-heavy topic. But what came out of the episode was just this larger theme of storytelling and of using data to paint a picture of the progress that we're making as a school. Hudson is just so knowledgeable, but he makes the information accessible. It's an episode you're not going to want to miss. So let's jump right in. All right, Hudson, I'm so excited to have you here on the School Leaders Project. Thanks so much for joining us.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks for having me.
So I'd love for you to kind of set the stage for our audience of just what's the role that you currently serve in your school and what's maybe a bit of your history with your school.
Absolutely. So like many small schools, wear many hats. Currently, that's assistant head of school, mainly overseeing our academic program, technology, and then other miscellaneous bits and bobs. And then also currently serving as director of technology, but working towards transitioning that role over to our assistant director next year.
Cool. Busy though. That's a lot of different pieces to navigate. Do you find it's helpful wearing so many hats because you can kind of have that whole picture, or is it just distracting at a certain point?
Well, I think it's great in terms of having, a finger on the pulse with everything. Like it's very hard for stuff to hide here.
Right.
And then personally, I love having a bit of an understanding of, what everyone on my team is up to and figuring out all the ways I can help them.
Super cool. And you've been at your school pretty much since it opened. Can you tell us a little bit about your school and kind of the evolution of tech that you've seen since you've been there?
Sure. So the downtown school, we've been around for 7 years. This is my 6th year here. So not quite one of the founders. I really wish I could have been one of the first 5. That just sounds like such a magical year.
You're
Um,
near enough. I'll count it.
Thank you. Thank you. I sometimes accidentally slip myself in with the other founders. But the school really has undergone a whole lot of change. Of course, going through enrollment changes in the first year, there were 45 students to, eventually we got to, I think it was year 4 or 5, we hit pretty close to full enrollment, which is 160 students.
Wow. Okay.
Um, but then also operationally, big changes in terms of going from a team of 5 to a team of 15, figuring out what processes and workflows worked well for us. How are we developing our administrative and faculty culture here? I'll also add one of the things that's really unique about us is the fact that there's almost no one who is purely just a teacher, right? All faculty are also administrators. And as far as I know, we're one of the only schools in the country that has a truly distributed leadership model.
Ooh, can you tell us a little bit about what that looks like?
Yeah, so we have our head of school who oversees the
Mhm.
rest of us, with me, I guess, sort of halfway being now in between these 2 layers as the assistant head. But we have all of our different tasks and administrative needs distributed across the entire team. So our
Mm.
English teacher, Brian, is our director of communications. Our physics teacher is our director of campus safety and facilities. And that's how I got my start. I was primarily
Cool.
a math teacher, taking on technology, and eventually graduating myself, up in responsibility and eventually, into my current role.
Do you find is that a function of just the size of the school, or is it an intentional choice to have increased ownership, kind of everybody as a stakeholder?
So it was very much an intentional choice
Hmm.
at the creation of the school. So the downtown school was created by Lakeside School. So we are a subsidiary of Lakeside. And their goal was to try to create a school that had the same sort of world-class academic experience as Lakeside,
Okay.
but at a much more affordable and accessible price point and geographic location. And one of the major cost savings, when you're trying to start a new school is to reduce overhead. And the distributed leadership model was a great way to do that, but also to develop buy-in from all the faculty in terms of the mission and success for the school.
That's so cool. Well, and like So many school models talk value agency and student agency, but I really think that's not quite possible unless teachers feel that sense of agency. So do you find that that kind of culture, I don't know, resonates throughout the entire school, that everybody feels a sense of ownership?
Yeah, 100%. It's hard to complain about your administration when you are the administration.
Yeah.
Uh, and there's not really an us versus them mentality here.
Which is wild because that's most schools have some element of that, some element of middle leadership or tension or pinching. But it sounds like that's a good way to mitigate that. It's just kind of sharing that ownership amongst more hands, more heads.
Yeah, if your administrator makes a decision you don't like, all you have to do is look in the mirror.
Can you get that on a shirt, like for all of your team?
Yeah.
So I'd love to dig in because you are like just a guru when it comes to data and school data, and that was kind of the my main mission of having you on here today is just to talk about this as a major issue that's happening in schools. What do you think are the kind of greatest challenges that leaders face in terms of data collection?
Well, first off, I'll say thank you. Guru sounds overly generous here. I'm just a person who's tried to solve problems using data, and get a little too nerdy about it at times. But
You got to have the
um,
nerds. Everybody nerds about something, and I love that yours is data.
but yeah, I think you're right. There are tons of challenges that schools face when it comes to thinking about the use of data. I mean, data driven decision making is not something that's new. For a long time, many organizations have, they said that they are making decisions based on data, or at least that's one of their top priorities. But then when you look at surveys, such as Project Unicorn does this data strategy and maturity survey every year. They ask the question, well, do you consider yourself a data driven school? And like 80% of orgs say, yeah, of course we are. And then they ask, getting into the weeds, like, well, what are the things that you have in place in terms of infrastructure to prove that you are data driven? And it's like 25% of schools say, like, oh yeah, we actually can do this. So there's there are a lot of challenges in the way. First off, just understanding, like, what is your current maturity when it comes to data. I think people sometimes have the wrong impression of where their org is currently at. I've heard schools say, like, oh yeah, we have tons of data, especially with AI coming out. And schools talking about, oh, like, we're just going to use AI to leverage all of our data because we
Isn't
have
that the
so much
biggest
of it.
buzzer? Using AI to leverage data. It's like everybody's saying that right now.
Yeah, and it's like, cool, what data? Where is it? How are you going to connect it to AI? Like, and most schools struggle to answer that kind of question.
What would you say if I'm a leader hearing this and going like, "Oh shoot, I'm calling myself a data-driven school." Like, how do you measure your maturity? Is there a scale that exists out there? Is there one you've created, or a way that you think about that shows a level of maturity?
So that's a great question, because I think the first step in order to leverage your data is to, one, understand what data you have, and then
Mm,
what is your current capacity to be able to access and use it. And Project Unicorn, like I mentioned, has a rubric for evaluating where your school is at in terms of data governance and strategy. Atlas also has a lot of great resources. The Atlas 360 guide that they publish or at least I believe publish every year, has a number of criteria to understand where your maturity is as well. And then I believe 2 summers ago, worked with the Center for Institutional Research and Independent Schools on crafting the guidebook for data-driven decision making. We
guru.
talk about that it was a big team effort, and definitely not the smartest person in the room. So, but in the guidebook, we put out again a lot of just information and resources about how to assess where your school's at.
Would you say the major skill sets there are collecting and then accessing data, or is it way more nuanced than that?
I mean, at its most basic, yes, but
Right.
the question's always the devil's always in the details of how.
Right.
And in fact, that's one of the big challenges is when you actually get into the weeds of how do we get data to connect between our different sources, there's a certain level of technical expertise that we're currently lacking across the independent school landscape. And it's a big challenge of how do we start to build up that bench of people who have those technical skills and also the knowledge about schools to understand what's going to be useful or necessarily resonate with other stakeholders at their school.
Are there AI tools that you've seen that are kind of a shortcut to that expertise, or do you think it's one of those that's a hard skill that we just need to have in schools?
I'm sure there are tons of tools that advertise themselves as solutions for that.
Right.
But I'm based on what I have seen and where I think schools should be focused right now, we're not currently at a place to really make heavy use of AI in a reliable and secure way.
Okay.
Before you can really make great use of AI, you need to have your data maturity in place.
Makes sense. Okay, so it's like chicken the egg. You have to have kind of a solid foundation before you can pull in those tools to leverage further.
Yeah, I mean, there's this old phrase in the sort of data world where garbage in equals garbage out.
Right.
And not that school data is garbage, but if we don't have reliable and useful information to feed into these systems, we shouldn't expect reasonable outcomes.
That makes total sense. I guess, so if I'm a school leader and I'm not necessarily the most tech savvy, and I'm starting to have this conversation with my team, how do I go about understanding what data is worth collecting?
Well, I mean, that's a great question because I've seen a few different approaches to this. The first approach, which I definitely don't recommend, is let's collect all the data, right? So there are good reasons to go out and map all of your data, for particularly cybersecurity and understanding where your school is at in terms of data privacy. You should go out and understand and map all of your data. But then to say, let's put it into, say, like a data warehouse where we can just comb through and look at all the data and surely we'll find something interesting.
Overwhelming.
That tends to not work well, right? Because what do you do with it?
Right.
To me, the better approach is start with the questions that you want to examine and answer. Really, what are the deep areas of interest that have just been lingering, or people are just been burning to explore further, right? And then think about what data supports answering those questions. That's how you should decide. And at the downtown school, I've been very fortunate because our team is so small.
Right.
Whenever these kind of deep questions come up, I'm right there to be like, oh, let me go look at what data we have. And then I can sort of filter these conversations down into some actionable data.
I think a lot of this can feel pretty theoretical. So, might you give an example of a strategic goal or a larger question that was asked, and then kind of follow those breadcrumbs of this is data that would be helpful in answering those questions?
Yeah. So, one of my first memories at the downtown school is I came in and our head of school, Sue Belcher, knew that I had an interest in applying the data skills I'd learned in my previous jobs to the downtown school. And she had this question about whether or not we were incorporating competencies into our curriculum. That was one of the things that the school was sort of founded with, is we were working on developing these 5 core competencies in all of our students. But how do we actually know we're living that? And so that was my question. That was the task, was, okay, how do we actually get data about this? Because I can't go to all the classes and watch, or I can't comb through all the assignments.
Right.
And so we thought about what ways could we leverage our LMS, which has always been Canvas, to keep track of when we're using competencies and how they're being assessed and measured. And so we sat down as a team to talk through training of this is how we use, say, the mastery transcript, not the mastery transcript, the mastery gradebook within Canvas. These are the norms that we're going to use for how do we mark and then grade those competencies. And then I would continue to watch the data flow in and see if there were any patterns. And sadly, what we learned was despite the work that people were doing in their classes, when it came to actually getting concrete evidence into our LMS that we could then share out, we weren't doing so hot. Which, it's like you can't hide from data, right? You can't escape. Like it's the truth, all right. But it became a really good starting point for us to really think about, like, okay, how do we want to incorporate competencies, and then what are the means in which we capture those? And so as a result of that, we actually started a pilot program where in each of our content departments, there would be at least one class doing a portfolio-based assessment where we would be specifically targeting those competencies.
Cool. A few things stand out there to me. The first is that in some ways, I feel like we kind of shy away from or hide from data, especially in smaller schools, because it's like, well, we don't have to. We don't have to use the like standardized test data. We're not trapped by that. And I think we can get the bad rep of like all data is bad. But what I'm hearing from you is no, if we're saying that we're assessing what we value and that measurement is saying that we're not on track, then something in our practice has to change. So I guess that would be question one is like, does having that data make shifts in pedagogy and practice easier to implement?
I mean, absolutely. And, in my mind, you can either choose to be constantly assessing and improving, which I don't know of any other way to do that other than to have some data. Otherwise, you're just kind of wandering blindly. I'm a big fan of Adam Grant,
Mm,
the organizational psychologist, and this idea of thinking again. It's like, I'd rather just be correct and then
right.
instead of being wrong for forever, right? And data is a shortcut to how do I know if I'm on the right track? But then also selfishly, especially with a small team like mine, there's a certain level of efficiency that we need in order to not be burnt out or to be wasting time on the wrong initiatives. And data is a way for us to help parse through that.
Well, and it so mirrors best assessment practices in the classroom. Like, just like we don't want to waste our students' time reteaching them things they already know, understand, and can do. If we have data that shows we're already succeeding in this area, yeah, let's find another strategic goal. Or even if we've been working on this 3 years and our data shows we've not grown at all, like all data is just it's a story of where we're going next. And I think it's easy to like get freaked out by, but it's so important to be able to have that shared language and the shared imagery of kind of the impact of what we've done.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that's one of those concerns that is a challenge to some institutions when it comes to using data.
Hmm.
That fear that, oh no, we're going to uncover something that's wrong. And really, what I think that boils down to is a culture of inflexibility, or a culture of trying to be overly conservative in maintaining, you know, maybe your institution's history or reputation.
Yeah.
Um, we don't have that because we're so new.
So yeah, that tension of conservation versus innovation and yeah, preservation versus innovation. Tricky. But also I think does that just come down to communicating the why of the strategic goal a bit better then? Like if there is that tension around change, it's like, well, is this a goal worth actually pursuing?
Absolutely. And I think that's one of the things I really love about our team is
Mm,
just the shared collective mission
right.
of, we're really trying to do what's best for our kids. Like, egos aside, let's use the data to tell us what we're doing right and where we can improve.
Awesome. Egos aside. Love that. In our first chat, you talked about this concept of like systems talking to each other. And I wonder if you could kind of dig a little bit more into that idea of what systems need to be taught. Is it all about just kind of choosing the right tech stack, or is it a bit more nuanced than that?
Oh, so this is such a tough question because there are a lot of different factors that influence what stack a school can use, and a lot of it is not even up to our own choice.
Mm,
So, for instance, the downtown school, like many schools, independent schools in the area, we're a member of PSIS, our regional admissions association, and we collectively agreed to all use a certain admissions database,
Okay.
something that we as an individual school have no choice in. And so that influences the way that we utilize data coming from that platform in relation to all of our other systems. So sometimes we have to just live with the reality of what we're dealt. Um, Also, I know from talking with and working with other larger schools that have been around for a lot longer, sometimes you've built up so much technical debt from these legacy systems. You have to figure out, well, if I'm wanting to bring in these new innovative tools, how do I get it to work with systems? You have to figure out, well, if I'm wanting to bring in these new innovative tools, how do I get it to work with the system that would take us, 5 years to replace?
Right. I have 50 years of alumni data and I want to switch systems. Now what?
Yeah, exactly. Like, what do we just do one giant spreadsheet export, and then how does that go into the other system? Like, what if something goes down and now we're stuck without anything? Like, those are not acceptable things and are every tech director's worst nightmare, right?
Well, and that begs the question of change management of like, when is the juice worth the squeeze? Like, it seems like the tech tool has to offer quite a panacea for to make it worth making that change of like, but all of this stuff we're gonna have to do on the back end. It's like, yeah, how do you know that? How do you know if a tech tool, if the juice is kind of worth the squeeze on that?
I mean, absolutely. And it comes back to, well, what are your needs and what questions are you trying to answer? Um, Over time, inevitably, this is something that has to happen with every system as things like cybersecurity change. And we find out that these legacy systems perhaps aren't up to snuff with the current standards for protecting our institutions. Or um, maybe we discover that the needs of, say, engaging student families
Mm.
are different than the way that our original admissions database was set up for.
Right.
Um, Needs that change over time. And so we have to be constantly evaluating. And it's really just, when does a tool no longer serve our needs? And when do we have to make a change?
It makes sense. Well, and staying grounded in thinking of yourself almost like a researcher. And this is our strategic goal. This is the big question we're seeking to answer. And does our the tools we do the tools we're using have the functionality to do that? And if not, what's next?
Yeah, and I know this is something that a lot of schools are really trying to work on right now, which is having better data governance in place. This is something that is not so new to industry in corporate America, but it's finally slowly started to make its way into schools. I mean, the idea of governance, of course, is not new. Um, Boards have been working on governance for ages, but the idea that we also have to apply it to our tech stack is a relatively new idea. And I think that's in some ways come up because of the increased cybersecurity risks that have arisen in the last decade. But also, I think schools are finally getting a desire to be a bit more sophisticated in how they're using data to both better serve their students and to be operationally more efficient.
Can you elaborate on that a little bit more? You mentioned that it's shifted in the past few years. What do you think that shift is?
So I think a lot of schools have started to get a bit frustrated with what data you're able to capture about a student just
Right.
through your SIS or LMS, right? We're trying to understand these students at deep levels in order to better serve their needs. And it's just hard when, say all you can enter for a student is a grade, right?
Right.
So how can we get more interesting data about our students?
So more data storytelling and capturing a more vivid picture of who our learners are as a result of their time with us.
Exactly, and doing it in a way that is manageable, right? Because I guarantee you, every database administrator has done a few thousand spreadsheet exports in their lifetime, and they've just had these folders of random file that is just got data from 3 years ago. Like, that's not tenable, right? So how do we make that better?
Right, because it's one thing to have like like you're saying, oodles of spreadsheets, but if nobody can make sense of them, and if nobody can use that to then tell a story of learning and journey and growth, then what's the point?
Yeah, exactly.
Beautiful. Another thing you mentioned, so we like chatted before this call, and you talked about the importance of future visioning and thinking about 10 years from now, today. What do you think leaders should be thinking about at the moment? Like, are there any trends that are coming up for you that are really important or that have shifted in the past couple years?
So certainly, I think there's going to be a huge shift at some point in my mind in terms of how we assess students. I
Mm,
think when you look at predictions and reports of what education is going to look like in, say, 2050, there's a lot more emphasis on students having certain competencies, things like um, high emotional quotient,
right.
ability to code switch, collaborate, right? And these things do get incorporated into our traditional curriculum. Um, but I think there's going to have to be a shift in how do we sort of educate students in those competencies more explicitly, and then how do we actually capture that they're actually growing in those areas over time.
Mm. What have you seen that excites you?
Well, I think, there have been some movements from groups like the Mastery Transcript Consortium, and of course,
So
they
cool.
were recently acquired by ETS. And I think that type of work, while they may not necessarily be the solution over time, I think that type of work and perhaps the use of AI is going to make it easier to capture that type of information about students.
Mm. Well, and is the why behind that, is the why behind needing a more vivid picture of our students as learners connected to AI, or does it stand alone? Like, was that a thing that you were thinking about even before AI entered the scene?
Well, I think it's something that's been needed for a while. I mean,
Right.
schools cry about grade inflation all the time, right? And why? It's because we've ended up with this measurement of student performance that's really hard to understand and doesn't always mean what we think it means.
Hmm.
And so we've needed some other metric for how our students growing, um, and something like mastery transcript or portfolio based assessment is just an alternative to that. And the AI piece is really just how do we make that more manageable? Because again, that's not a new idea,
Right.
but I think schools struggle with how do you actually facilitate the amount of time and relational work it takes for teachers to be able to accurately capture that type of information about your student.
Beautiful. Is that the primary trend you're seeing in data collection, is just the assessment and storytelling, or are there other aspects of it? Like we've talked a bit about cybersecurity, things like are there other questions that you're asking or data that you're collecting that is exciting you at the moment?
So, of course, being our tech director, I work closely with our admissions department. So,
Mm.
there's a lot of data, of course, that every school is using to try to understand who are the students and families they're reaching, right? How do we think about building our community to be the community we want? So, thinking about, how do we understand our place in the community? There's a lot of interesting data there. I think also internally, there's a lot of interesting data in terms of our process and how do we know that we're engaged in an equitable admissions process.
Mm.
That's actually been one of my favorite projects in the last few years is going through and analyzing things like interview transcripts or interview write-ups or sorry for the edit that made it sound like we are recording our interviews. We do not record our interviews.
Okay.
um, but reading through interview write-ups and looking at things like rubric scores, and then the type of notes that we're entering into our admissions database when we're in committee. And it's one of those things that we can say like we believe that we are a fair and equitable school when it comes to admissions, but
Right.
thanks to the data we know.
We're seeing the biases or the patterns or things we might not have noticed are kind of emerging over time.
Yeah, absolutely.
Mm. Can we circle back to that first point you mentioned too? You talked a little bit about kind of marketing and admissions. Like when you're talking about that data, is that more like SEO? Is that value proposition, or is there other data that you're able to collect to better handle that process?
So it's a combination. So there certainly are things like web analytics and SEO that we can analyze in terms of what's our digital presence.
Right.
There's also focus group information where we have solicited feedback from applicants, current families, alumni to understand how did the value proposition align with the message we were selling in
Mm,
our admissions. And that's been immensely helpful for a new school, of course, as we're still navigating long term what kind of school do we want to be.
interesting. And do you find that that impacts things like your vision, your mission, your values? Like, are those constantly evolving in response to that, or is it more the other way around of like, oh wait, no, our mission stays core and we're realizing that what we're actually putting there out there in line and who we're attracting or the what we're creating isn't aligning. Like where is there room for tuning there?
Well, I would like to think, as I'm sure most schools think, that our mission is solid and that
Cool.
at our core principles, we're always going to be the same school. Um, I think that we started off as a fairly forward-facing, forward-looking, and innovative school, and I think our mission will last for a while. It's
Cool.
more about how do we communicate and build up the community around that mission.
Beautiful. So it all comes back to that idea of storytelling to me. We have a solid set mission. So what questions are we asking to validate our mission? And then what data are we collecting to also connect back to that mission and just kind of show that all of those pieces are indeed connected and to find almost the outliers to make those changes.
Absolutely. And, you keep hitting on this idea of storytelling being like a central theme. And
Yeah.
very much data without storytelling is useless. I mean, I tell this to my students in my statistics class that, um, yeah, your numbers don't mean anything unless you can, put together some visualizations, tell a story, right? Um, and yeah, and if you can't adequately tell a story with your data, then it's a good signal perhaps that you should be evaluating, why am I collecting this data in the first place?
Yes. Yes, yes, yes. Why am I collecting this? Well, and I think when we take that stance as administrators and we model that for our educators, again, it just becomes this mirror for what happens in the classroom of what data are we collecting about our students and why and how are we communicating its value and telling the story there that we can just create these, I don't know, mirrors of culture that echo throughout the entire school.
I know. I swear, because I'm the data guy, that I sometimes get this perception at school that I like collecting data for the sake of data, and that's definitely not the case. Proof in point being, my wife and I just had our third child, and
Congrats.
kind of got in trouble for stop recording all of the diapers I was changing in our baby data app. And it's just like data for the sake of data, right?
So how do you make that clear to teachers and how do you help them to see that it isn't just data for data's sake, that it will have an impact on their practice longer term, that in turn will have an impact on like the larger mission and vision of the school? Like how do you tell that story well?
Well, I think it comes back to ultimately starting with good questions. I mean,
Right.
so many of the projects that I've worked on stemmed from there was some struggle that the teachers were having, and how could we use data to solve that? So, for
Mm,
example, um, there was this issue of how do you efficiently write comments each quarter for your student, um, capturing all the pieces of feedback that you've put in all these individual assignments. Um, and one of the solutions was we connected our LMS to our data warehouse to be able to extract all of the comments that teachers had made throughout the quarter.
wow.
And we're able to then feed that back in a better organized fashion to the teachers so they could see like, aha, these are the 10 things I said to the student in this last term. And then they could use that to start crafting their comments.
So just to see the patterns that again, it's interesting. I hadn't really thought about it that way, that consistently we're doing things and it's easy because we're in the flow of life. But that when you zoom out in that way, it's easier to go, oh, here's a pattern. Oh, here's another pattern. And that when we have those patterns, we can make predictions and we can move forward. That's cool. That's
Absolutely.
cool.
And
That's it.
also, our single college counselor, Christopher, who is amazing, it's quite a task for him to write, 40 students' college profiles, all by himself. Also, mind you, being a dean of academics and a grade level advisor.
Right.
Um, and he uses that same data to draft these kids' college profiles.
Cool.
So that's what I'm talking about is, starting with a problem and
Right.
then build data up around it.
Hmm. May I ask, what's a problem that you are excited to explore more and articulate further in the next year?
So one of the things that is constantly been a struggle for not just us, but I know for almost every school is how do we make ourselves more efficient when it comes to student support?
Okay.
And a lot of the work over the last couple of years has been building up a data platform that allows not just myself, but multiple people at the school to see all these individual data points from across our system for any given student, while also being able to see those big picture trends across grades and classes. And
So is that like
so
attendance grade? Like which kind of data points are you kind of, or are you still in the process of figuring out what those are?
So there's always more that we could pull in. Trying to not go too crazy because again, we don't just need every data point for the sake of having it.
Right.
Um, but touching the data from our LMS so that we know academically from the day-to-day work where our students are in terms of not just their grade, but in terms of are they submitting work on time?
Mm,
Are they missing a bunch of assignments? Currently, we're able to see across all of our all of our students in classes, this student, sure, to an individual teacher, it looks like, oh, they've only missed one or two assignments. But when you see like all of their classes, you're like, oh my gosh, this kid has missed 10 things in the last, 2 weeks, right?
cool.
And that enables us as a school to better respond to that student's needs.
Well, and to catch it earlier, that it's not the end of the school
Exactly.
year and we're looking backwards going, oh man, this was a red flag. It's hopefully in a week or 2 weeks, we're able to these are the red flags of a student that we know is in crisis. We can catch that pattern earlier.
Exactly. And that's, again, going back to the challenges that schools face. A
Mm.
lot of schools have perhaps some sense of like, even if they have a sense of rather what data they want to keep track of, having the data pipelines in place to be able to act on that data quickly is a real barrier without some technical expertise. And
Mm.
the fact that our data is constantly updating every single day, sometimes even every minute,
Overwhelming.
but we're able to keep up and know that the data that we're looking at is accurate, and we don't have to wait for some period of time before someone runs a report or sends out a spreadsheet.
So we're trying to remove the gatekeeping there of making the data just accessible to as many people in as clear a way as possible.
And as securely as possible too.
Oh, it's so many different factors to consider, really. Like, how am I keeping it safe? How am I increasing access? How am I actually using it? It's a lot
I
to
know
keep in
it's
mind.
it's like data governance is hard, right?
Oh, what's your biggest advice there, just in terms of all of those moving pieces? Like, is there a framework you use to kind of keep all of that straight, or is it more instinctual for you? Or, yeah, what does that look like for you?
So I would say one of the things that I'm really pleased with from our Cirrus guidebook is we lay out what it looks like to form a data governance committee at your school to begin
Ooh,
that high level strategic work of figuring out what data do we have, what are the types of questions we're trying to answer, how do we figure out who has access to this data, and then how do we start to develop and roll out different projects
Cool.
using that data. So
Hmm.
I think that's a good framework for schools to start with. Just this idea of how do we start to build up that data governance committee and give them a charter to get started on this work.
Wild. Okay, so a data governance committee. What are the different hats that a data like that, or the different roles that exist in that committee? Just as kind of a primer.
So there should be some sort of chair, the person who is going to oversee all the work of the group. Um, then you should start to think about the different stakeholders when it comes to the use of the data. So you have data stewards who are perhaps in charge of specific domains of the school and can coordinate, say, with your communications or admissions department, with your academics. And then within each of those departments, you have the people who actually do almost all of the work for us, which are the data custodians. They're the people who are like, no, I own this database. I'm the one who makes sure that the data is clean, it's entered in a timely manner. Um, we include those data custodians because honestly, they're the ones who have the most insights for the rest of the team. But then it also includes stakeholders who are users and consumers of the data so that, again, you're understanding what are the needs and concerns of the people who actually touch it.
Cool. I guess that was going to be my next wondering is there a role for students in all of this, and do you have them as part of these kinds of committees, or how much should your students know about how data is collected, organized, used in your school?
I don't know if I would say that students should necessarily be on a data governance committee because I feel
Right.
like that's a little too operational, like in terms of operations, a little too in the weeds. But certainly, I think students should be aware of how data is being used, especially, because we're talking about sensitive, personally identifiable information of students. Um, and they should understand sort of their rights. There are certain regulations and protections in place across the country. And the students should understand that we care about their personal cybersecurity and that we're not going to be putting their data at risk.
Beautiful. So more kind of like the overarching view, not necessarily in the weeds there.
Yeah,
Right.
community.
Beautiful. All right, last question for you. I guess, what would be your biggest advice for a school leader who doesn't consider themselves a tech leader, but kind of wants to become more mature in their thinking on data? What would be a first step that they might take to feel more confident in this space?
So one, recognize that you're not alone and certainly welcome anyone to join, these communities that I've been very fortunate to join, like Atlas, like Cirrus. Cirrus, we have a very active Slack group with some 300 of us on it, where we are
Wow.
constantly pinging ideas about like, hey, what kind of surveys are you sending out? What are you thinking in terms of data visualization tools? Um, it's really overwhelming, like you mentioned, to kind of dive into this without a bunch of experience. Come join us, nerds, right? We're all learning together.
So then I think it can feel intimidating. So to kind of say it is a welcoming community, and no matter where you are on that spectrum of tech understanding, that there's a community there to support you and to engage that curiosity.
Yeah, the fact that you're thinking about it already puts you ahead of a bunch of people.
So cool. An inclusive community. I love that. Awesome. Well, Hudson, this was an absolute delight. I think it's just a masterclass in data. I know you probably will hate that term, but just such a privilege to talk with you and hear how your brain works and to get clarity on just this idea of storytelling and data isn't where I thought the conversation would go. So I just really appreciate your insight.
No, and thank you so much. It's been great getting to chat.
Awesome.